From FL1 News, you're listening to episode 186 of the Inside the FLX podcast. Our program begins earlier this month when the news that GateHouse and Gannett, two of the country's largest newspaper companies, would be merging. The $1.4 billion acquisition will be completed by GateHouse and will create one of the largest merged organizations ever seen in the media landscape. New Media CEO Mike Reed said in a statement after the merger announcement that the deal would, quote, not only preserve but actually enhance quality journalism, end quote. But there are big concerns, and we'll discuss those today with our panel. Ted Baker, he hosts Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. Jim Meaney, he founded the Geneva Believer, an independent publisher covering the city of Geneva. And Professor Stephen Keeler, he leads the School of Media and Arts at Cayuga Community College. First thing I want to do is just go around the table and what's the reaction to the news? The personal reaction. What's your personal reaction to the news that for billions of dollars, as it turns out, Gannett and GateHouse will soon be one? Steve, let's start with you.
Well, I think from a news perspective, it would appear with the GateHouse business model that it's not a good story for local news coverage. GateHouse typically, cuts newsroom staff. So that does not bode well for the future of, I think, the communities that GateHouse and Gannett will serve together.
And Ted?
Well, I'm not surprised at all. My industry went through a lot of mergers and consolidation quite some time ago, and I got booted out of a job as the result of one. So I'm not surprised, and I agree. It's not a good day for journalism at all.
And Jim, sort of bringing the truly independent publisher's perspective into the conversation. When you heard about the merger, what were your first thoughts, and what were some of the things that went through your mind?
Well, the first thing I thought was that I'm not surprised, and it also helped remind me of why I do what I do, because this is something that's been going on for years and years and for decades. The consolidation of media and the way it affects local media. So it's like everyone else said, it's bad news for local journalism, but it's why I do what I do. And
to give our listeners a little bit of a reminder, the Geneva Believer. It's an independent news org that you run yourself, you founded yourself. How many years ago now?
A little over 3 years now. And
what are some of the things that you guys cover that you sort of focus on or focus the coverage on?
Focus on whistleblowing, as it's called, city officials, the inner machinations of city government. By filing FOIL requests and getting leaks and sources and bringing the kind of news, doing the kind of investigation that's really difficult, if not impossible, for a lot of the news organizations to do these days because of cutbacks and because of.
And Ted, you and I have talked on the Debrief podcast a million times now, it seems, about how even for the smaller or non-merged news organizations, that's tough to do. That investigative journalism is effectively gone. When you see this now, what does the local media landscape look like through your eyes, given that there are GateHouse and Gannett properties sort of scattered and peppered around the Finger Lakes?
Well, for us in radio, there isn't anybody that has the time to do that kind of work. I mean, one of the things about that investigative type of journalism is sometimes it leads to nothing, and you've got to publish. If you're the newspaper, you got to have some stories. If you're the radio station, you have to have some stories in the newscast. So a lot of organizations, I think, just find it a luxury they don't have anymore with the reduced staffing levels, because you can investigate something for weeks and weeks, and if it doesn't pan out, then you've got nothing to show for it.
And Steve, is there a reaction from the television news landscape to moves like this, these sort of merger? Obviously, TV's gone through its own sort of reshaping and merging, kind of the way radio has consolidation over the years. But is there, as we see more of these sort of mega mergers happen, is there a different approach that TV might take to how they're doing news on a daily basis?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, we see local television news certainly doesn't have the investigative staff that it used to. And I think, you can see a parallel with that in print journalism, where just like, what Ted said, unless it's a fairly big daily newspaper, the investigative staff, the folks that go in depth into stories, just aren't working there anymore. And it's a shame, because we have so many local communities now that just there's no news coverage about what's going on in the community, whether it's government news, community news, anything like that. The staffs just aren't there anymore. It's interesting. I read a study the other day. I think it was from the University of North Carolina. Said something like there are 1,800 fewer newspapers in this country than there were in 2007, and 1,300 communities that had a newspaper in 2007 today no longer have one. And so where do folks get their local news from? And who's watching local governments?
And obviously, there's always a lot of discussion about, well, it's Facebook's fault. Facebook is sucking the life out of news because people are getting their news or information from Facebook, right or wrong. Is that a little bit too much of a blanket statement? There have to be other factors involved, right?
Oh, and sure. I mean, and the factors I think are pretty complex. But if we take a newspaper as an example, why are we seeing print newspapers decline? Well, it's because of the decline in advertising revenue. What caused the decline in advertising revenue? Well, I mean, look at how few classified ads there are, if any, in a local daily newspaper. Mm-hmm. Where are the classified ads? Well, they're on Craigslist. Craigslist was the great disruptor of the classified ad business, which was, it's kind of the bread and butter of a lot of newspapers. They ran their classifieds, and there was a lot of money in that. And then, if you look at local advertisers, online advertising has just sucked the life out of print advertising. And you can certainly see, if you look at revenues over the last 20 years, advertising revenues, you can see how it's shifted from print to online. So can we blame Facebook? Yeah, I think we can. I think we can blame these mega media companies that are online, Facebook, Google, Twitter, for shifting ad revenue to them and away from print newspapers.
And even away from small, independently owned organizations. We can sort of look at ourselves as an example of Finger Lakes One. When people hear that, most advertising is done online, they assume that we're just rolling in the ad dollars, but reality is that Google and Facebook are controlling a lion's share of that. I believe something like 90% of the total. So moving forward, this is one of the things that I've been really curious about, and I really wanted to ask you is, does this change the pitch to your students at all? Or what is this conversation like with a bunch of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who are trying to make a go of this journalism thing or communications thing as a career?
Well, I think for young people who want to get into the business, they need to look at the digital outlets. And they need to look at successful multimedia companies. That's where the jobs are. I mean, there's certainly been an explosion of growth in jobs on the digital side, mm-hmm. and that's really what they have to look at. And they need to be well versed in social media communications. At a local television station now, there's probably just as many jobs on the social media and website side as there are on camera. Mm-hmm. So if a young person can learn how to write journalistically and learn how to do it on on multimedia platforms, then they're probably in pretty good shape, and they're probably pretty employable. But if they think that, what I want to do is be an investigative reporter for a newspaper, that's certainly a laudable goal, but there's far fewer of those jobs than there were 20 years ago.
Now, Jim, I'm thinking about what you do and the path you sort of took to founding The Believer, a little more in line with I guess what most people would consider to be independent creator. How was that process for you? And looking back at it, are there any things that you would do differently, knowing what you do now about the landscape and what it would ultimately grow into?
Oh, well, excuse me, the process was, I really didn't have a solid plan in place when I started it. I wanted to start a blog because I was seeing conflicts of interest and things going on in the city. I had when I went to college many years ago, I actually studied journalism for a little while. I never completed my degree, but it's always been something that I've cared about. So I kind of just started, I was winging it from the get-go. I started a free blog and I attached a Facebook page to it, and that was it. Looking back, if there were things I could have done differently, really, I think that maybe having more of a presence on other social media. I mean, to me, that's where that's one of the things I feel like I haven't been strong enough in, is not just in Facebook, but Instagram, Twitter. But that takes time, and that takes experience, and that takes some knowledge that I don't necessarily have. What was the other part of the question?
Well, in terms of how you approach, I mean, it seems like sort of the independent creator. I mean, obviously, what Steve's talking about is finding the publishers and finding the organizations that are pushing the envelope in terms of what they're doing digitally and with new medias in general. But the flip side of that is also it seems like there could be a reasonable pitch now or soon to be, go do this yourself. Just go out and do this yourself. You've graduated, start to learn, start in a small community, and it almost serves as a quasi-public service at the same time, right? Like,
sure.
And I guess when I talk to you guys who have quite a bit of experience collectively, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or is that somewhere in between? I guess, Ted, we could start with you on that part of it.
Well, I think it's a good thing. I think more and more people are adopting that model. We're starting to see some websites popping up that play kind of the role that newspapers used to. But to go back to what you were talking about before, what led to all this, newspapers also were backing away from investigative journalism anyway, because that's the problem with advertising-driven media. Do you go after the investigative story that may wind up involving the president of your biggest advertiser? Or in the case of a small-town newspaper, how many times do you see the publisher of a small-town newspaper and he's also the president of the Chamber of Commerce? You know, how independent can you be? I mean, Jim's not beholden to anybody, and so he can go full speed ahead and tell it like it is. You don't have to worry about who you're going to offend.
Well, and is there also an element of sort of finding your niche, finding your specialty? Because obviously Peter Mantius has been on the program, on our program here a bunch of times. He focuses on sort of the environmental journalism aspect here in the Finger Lakes. You're focusing on sort of the watchdog city stuff in a specific community. Does it need to become a little more utilitarian in terms of where people are focusing their effort, instead of just being that sort of what TV, I guess, would call that sort of run-and-gun reporter, multimedia journalist?
Well, I mean, let's face it. You know what Jim does, what Peter Mantius does. I mean, they're journalists, and they're legitimate journalists, and they're providing a very, very valuable service to the communities that they're in. And we call, the term for that now is the citizen journalist, and that has a lot of value to us as citizens and as taxpayers, to have people like that, keeping an eye on government, keeping an eye on how government spends our money and the decisions they make. The problem is, it has to be someone who has a passion for doing that, because citizen journalists typically don't get paid unless, they happen to be very clever about attracting advertising, right? Mm-hmm. That's the only way they're going to get paid, is to attract advertising to their website, or to their Facebook page or their YouTube feed or whatever. And it's really kind of unfair to the citizen journalists to expect them to do this for free, because folks you can only do that for so long before life interferes and you may have to stop doing it. And then what happens? That very valuable source of news and commentary then goes away. So I think while it's a great service, I think it's also very unfair, for us to expect citizen journalists to continue to do it unpaid over a long period of time. And so, what it shows, and what about communities where there isn't someone who has that passion? What do those communities do? So it's sort of very unfair in the current media landscape. If we're lucky enough to have somebody like Jim, then you're in a community where you're informed. If you live in another community where there isn't someone like Jim, and there's no local paper, no local news outlet, you're out of luck. And again, I just don't think that's a good situation for us to be in as a democracy and as citizens in a democracy.
So I want to get your guys' reaction to a quote from New Media CEO Mike Reed. New Media is going to basically be the company that is overseeing this Gannett GateHouse combined effort. He said, quote, "Not only will this preserve but actually enhance quality journalism," end quote. And he's referring to the merger. A merger where a lot of folks are worried about cuts being the primary thing that comes from it. Sort of going around the table, what's your reaction and what's the concern? Do we think that actually will verify in a year, 2 years, 3 years, where we see smaller staffs, consolidated staffs, and not much else out of a merger of this size when you're talking about shareholders and all of the things that come along with that sort of like corporate approach to doing journalism?
Who do you want to start with?
We can start with you. Work around.
I don't know. There's kind of a contradiction here because GateHouse is buying Gannett, right? So GateHouse is in charge, even though they're going to retain the Gannett name. So the GateHouse model over the last 15 years has been to buy newspapers and chains of newspapers, consolidate the operations, and cut newsroom staff. So certainly if I was working for a Gannett paper or even a GateHouse paper, I'd be worried, because that's been their practice and that's their business model. And their business model is also to take print-centric papers and turn them into more of a multimedia operation and enhance their digital presence as a way to attract more advertising. However, the SEC filing that GateHouse made says they're not going to cut staff. They're not going to cut newsroom staff. That what they're looking to do is cut print staff, consolidate production, and sell real estate. So, their SEC filing doesn't mention anything at all about cutting newsroom staff. So there's kind of a contradiction here. So it'll be interesting to see what they really do going forward. But I think if I was in a newsroom, I'd be worried.
And Ted, when you hear it, when you hear that statement from Mike Reed, CEO of New Media, do you take that at face value, or do you sort of play the cautious wait and see game?
I take it as a giant bucket load of bull crap. They don't care about journalism, and they don't care about the product. I mean, Steve's talking about selling real estate. They're going to buy these properties, strip them to the bone, run them cheaply, and that's part of the problem with newspapers that's led to this death spiral. You can't save your business by making the product you put out worse. It doesn't work in newspapers, it doesn't work in radio, it doesn't work anywhere. You can't make cuts. Gee, we don't have as much advertising, so let's put out a thinner paper. I mean, everybody jokes about that. And I mean, I know a lot of people in the newspapers around here, and I feel bad for them, but this isn't going to do anybody good except for a few shareholders. If I were in the journalism business, I think I would be looking at moving to the digital realm and doing something like you're doing at Finger Lakes One or like Geneva Believer is doing. Maybe consolidate a handful of people together and have one guy who's the city hall government muckraker and someone else who's on environment and move it over to that digital realm. It's like we talked about the other day. My business of radio, I don't know if radio will exist in 20 years, but I know that the kind of content that we put out in News Talk Radio will be still being put out somewhere.
Right.
On the web, on your phone, on your toaster, I don't know. But there's always going to be room for that content. It's just how to get it out there and how to make any kind of money in this fragmented world. That's the problem, is the whole idea of mass media, the big TV networks and the big radio networks broadcasting to millions of people, that's going away, and now it's people with small little followings scattered out throughout the internet.
Well, and Jim, doesn't it feel a little bit impossible? I mean, you yourself are independent in every single way. You do most, if not all, of the work. When you talk about, or when you see sort of this consolidation happening, but the product not evolving with it, so a daily newspaper continuing to be a daily newspaper, but with less and less and less and less staff, when you think about how much work you put into a single story, is it one of those scenarios where you just sort of sit back and chuckle to yourself? It's like, this can't work. It can't work, but I guess you're going to keep doing it anyway.
Well, yeah, it's clearly not working, and I really can't say it any better than Ted said it. With these consolidations, with the change in media, where the shareholders are the most important people in the whole picture. You can't. It can't. It's not. It's not sustainable. It's not informing people enough. Yeah, and it's frustrating. And I am independent. I'm also independent of any sort of income from what I do, which is okay right now because I love doing it and I love providing the service. I do know that I don't know what the future holds. I think that Finger Lakes One might be onto something with the way that you've worked with Peter Mantius to sort of have his blog hosted or co-hosted, or however you're working that. Maybe that's going to be the future, is bringing independent journalists, citizen journalists, under an umbrella of a larger digital media website or what have you. But right now it's heartbreaking. It's going on, and it's happening more and more. Steve gave the numbers. It's really a sad landscape for people who work in the industry and for people who need to be informed.
And to that end, does this mean now that we've sort of hit a wall with the whole free content arena, I guess I'll call it? Have we hit a wall there where there needs to be a way, or there just needs to be a little bit of awareness, I guess, on behalf of those who are consuming these digital products that are at face value free, to find a way to contribute to the thing that they're using all of the time? Obviously, advertising is drying up across the board. So does that mean that we've hit a wall with the subscription model, and what needs to change, or what do we sort of see as potential opportunities to sort of find revenue to put money into these things, investigative journalism, general news coverage even, I guess, or just operational stuff? Ted, any
Well, it's very difficult to get people to pay for information because there's so much of it out there. So if paper X goes behind a paywall, okay, I'll go over here to Y and see what they have to say. So the challenge is to convince the public that there's some value in what you're doing that's worth paying for. Now, I think the model of, it's annoying as heck when you click on a website, so you see something in Twitter, you click on the link, and it's behind a paywall. You sign up, get a subscription, or you have 3 free articles left. I've heard people talk about some sort of system of micropayments where, would you pay 5 cents to look at this article? I'd probably be more willing to do that. I can't tell you how annoying it is to go on a website, because I go on websites all morning long to look at topics to talk about on the morning show, and the very first thing you do when you come to a website, something flies down in front of what you're looking at telling you need to sign up or join our email list or sign up for a free account. No, leave me alone. But if I could just click on the article and have 5 cents taken out of my bank account, I might do that. I don't know if that is a model that would work, but I know that the current model of annoying the hell out of your potential customers doesn't really work at all.
And Steve, when you look at it, and when you look at budding journalists, people who are going to eventually be carrying the torch and carrying this industry forward, does there have to be some sort of change in the way that people consume, or in terms of how they pay for what they're consuming?
Well, it's an interesting question. I read a really interesting article in Forbes magazine last month, where they talked about the idea that, okay, so you have, and again, I'll go back to Google and Facebook and Twitter. A lot of people get their news from Facebook and Google and Twitter, but what is the news that they're getting? Well, it turns out that, most major news organizations are on there. And so if I'm on Facebook, I can get news from the NBC network, I can see news from local papers, from national papers. But it turns out that Facebook and Google, they're not paying for that content.
Right.
It's just being provided to them for free. But they're making a fortune from that content, because many people will go to their Facebook page, or they'll go to their Twitter feed, and they'll say, oh, what did CNN say about this? Oh, what is NBC saying about this? Oh, what is the New York Post saying about this? Right? That's all being provided for free by those news organizations to Twitter, for example. So there's a move in Congress right now and there's been some discussion about ways to make these mega corporations that are on the web, like Google and Facebook and Twitter, ways to make them pay for that content and support the production of news, both on a local level, regional level, and national level. And apparently the talk is getting very serious, because believe it or not, even politicians are worried about the sort of dearth of journalism at this point. They're not seeing it as a very good thing.
Well, because they're not getting coverage, good or bad,
right,
like they did 10 years ago. I mean,
exactly.
You can say that, some elected officials are able to sort of live in a vacuum, and the Geneva Believer is a good example of an organization that's trying to push back against that. But at the same time, I mean, the good things aren't getting out there either, like they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. My curiosity is, and this is just sort of my personal perspective on where we are in the media landscape in general. So when you look at the Finger Lakes, if you live in the central Finger Lakes, there are probably, I can think of 4 or 5 daily newspapers that you could subscribe to. And then there's a handful of digital organizations that you could also subscribe to in some way, shape, or form. But you're talking about, if you're subscribing to The Citizen, if you're subscribing to the Finger Lakes Times, if you're subscribing to the Chronicle Express, which is a weekly, if you're subscribing to the Canandaigua Messenger, the DNC, you're subscribing to all of these things because if you live in northern Seneca County, if you live in Ontario County, if you live in Wayne County, all of the news in all of those places or from all of those outlets is of interest to you. It has an impact on you. But you can't, most people, I think, reasonably could afford to subscribe to one. Mm-hmm. They can't afford to subscribe to all of them. That just isn't and that seems to be the ask that most newsrooms are putting out to their readers is, subscribe to us. You should subscribe to us. And yes, in principle you should. But at the same time, if you really want to know what's going on in your region, if you really want to know and understand the complete picture, you need to subscribe to 5 or 6 different organizations and spend, between $8 and $12 a pop a month for those subscriptions. If you're talking about digital subscriptions, and even more if you're talking about print, you're talking about like an investment of, $60, $70 a month. That's completely unreasonable. And you mentioned this sort of micropayment methodology. I think to some degree that might work, but Ted, it's one of those scenarios where I think we might have had some discussions about this in the past, but like, where do you draw the line? Like, where do you create that line in the sand where, okay, you've passed this threshold, so moving forward it will cost, as you said, 5 cents. No, it's just
well, that's the big debate. And also, you talk about the subscription model, and they're asking us to subscribe at a time when, as Steve said, you've got consolidation in plants now. Many daily newspapers, their deadline is so early because they have to get the thing off to Timbuktu where it's being printed and then shipped back, that when you get that information, it's not current anymore. I mean, I do sports scores in the morning. The Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester completely gave up on getting last night's scores in the newspaper. You can get them online if you have the digital subscription. So I think one of the failures of some of the print media is to change their model a little bit. For example, I grew up, I'm a sports fan. You had the Sporting News and Sports Illustrated, and both those publications realized they couldn't be timely news outlets anymore because there's ESPN Sports Center. So I don't need to know what happened in the game because I just saw it last night at 10 o'clock. I need some perspective or more feature-oriented kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the areas where some of the traditional media might have a better chance of surviving. It's don't tell me who won the game because I already know. Tell me why. Tell me more about this guy that hit the winning shot.
Have they already missed that opportunity, though? Because I think of, we see movies being released now on Netflix. We see in-depth, lengthy features being released on YouTube as opposed to traditional platforms and traditional sort of... So I don't want to say is it already slipping away from them or has it already slipped away from them, but have newspapers backed themselves into a space where there isn't a viable future for them in general, even if they were to shift gears and to try to create a unique product that would be palatable to people because they are getting that product elsewhere in a new media sense?
It's not going to be easy, but again, the biggest challenge for all of us putting out any kind of information is in this vast ocean of information, why should I pay for yours when I can find something just like it over here that's free? So that's the big challenge, is how do we, whoever we are, newspaper, website, whatever, how do we convince people that what we're doing is worth paying for in a sea of things that you don't have to pay for?
And Jim, one of the things that I've marveled at in the past are the folks who can sit through an entire Geneva City Council meeting, because those tend to be absolute marathons. Seneca County Board of Supervisors meetings and committee meetings might give them a run for their money, but you're talking about what,
Sometimes 3 hours.
Sometimes 3 hours.
I've seen them go up to 5.
So, all right. So, from the news coverage standpoint, what kind of challenge does that create? And I want to ask all three of you guys that, because say you have a reporter who maybe they don't have a deadline, but they're sitting there for 3, 4, 5 hours just taking notes essentially on a meeting, and then they have to go back to their office or back home, and there may be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories maybe that come out of that meeting. You got to sort of cherry pick which one you want to approach. Is that also part of the issue where the staffing levels are so low for a lot of these organizations that you get maybe one story out of a city council meeting, and that's kind of it, like nothing else?
Yeah. Well, I think in Geneva, it's what usually happens is the Finger Lakes Times will have a reporter at the meeting. A lot of times that reporter will leave early
because of the deadline.
To get the deadline,
Yeah.
9:30, whatever time they have to go. Fortunately for us in Geneva, we have all of our city council meetings broadcast and recorded videotape, so they can be reviewed later. But yeah, that's what I see going on in the Finger Lakes Times. I think yesterday or two or 3 days ago, there was an article that came out about a discussion that happened in the city council meeting a week or two before. So yeah, that's another one of the challenges, and fortunately for us in Geneva, we can go back and watch it and figure out what the stories were, and I do that all the time. But that's not something everybody can do.
So, and one of the things that we just talked about a couple days ago on the Debrief podcast was a new law signed by Governor Cuomo, which enforces IDAs across the state to live stream all of their meetings. Interesting, because I think that's sort of a reaction to not only the distrust with IDAs and how they operate. But at the same time, it seems like it's a bit of an acknowledgement that the local press just isn't getting it done anymore. Is that, and I said that, that should be mandated across the board for all governing agencies in general. If you are a municipality, if you're a school board, whatever the case may be, it should have to be broadcast and live streamed on your website. That's just, you have to post meeting minutes. You should also have to live stream your meetings or sessions in general. Is that going to be necessary, we think, moving forward, given the shrink that's continuing to happen?
It would be a big help because, what Jim's talking about, very few radio stations, especially small town ones, have done that in a long time. In fact, I saw a story not too long ago that was talking about that there are several state capitals in our country where there's no regular daily beat person who covers the capital at all. That's the state capital. There's just, the staffing is a fraction of what it used to be. And, Geneva should consider itself lucky that it's got a website and a newspaper who both do that. I did that back in my early radio days where you go to a meeting, they go into executive session, 2 hours later they come out and say no action taken and hit the gavel. And you're going, oh, that was great. That's 2 hours I won't get back. So it just, the hard work of journalism, there aren't very many people left around to do it.
And Steve, is it just kind of surprising maybe at this point that hasn't happened? A lot of folks have said, well, why don't news organizations go live stream? They ask, us at Finger Lakes One that all the time. They'll say, well, why don't you guys go live stream this government board meeting? And the reaction or the answer is always, well, it's just not in the budget.
Right. Who's going to set up the camera and who's going to point it at the meeting and who's going to take it down when it's over?
That's not your job. It's not the job of a news organization to take over the streaming of public meetings. It should be the public entity that does that streaming. And I think, over time we're going to see more and more of that happening because it's much easier and much cheaper to do. The value of it is not so much for the public, because most members of the public don't want to sit through a 3 or 4 hour meeting either. But where there is real value is for for local news organizations to be able to go in and look at specific parts of a meeting that may be important and that may be newsworthy, rather than having to sit through the whole meeting. You can go to the archive of that municipality, find that video file, scan through it until you find the section where that has the newsworthy moment or whatever, and then report that. Right? People are still hungry for news. You can see what Jim does is certainly proof of that. What Ted does is proof of that. If you go to Jim's blog, if you go to the Finger Lakes News website, there's really, really good content there. And it's easy to read, and it gives you great information. And people want that. Same thing with your site. If Finger Lakes One does a great job, producing and curating local news. The public wants it. The issue is, the audience is used to getting it for free. They don't really want to pay for it anymore. What happens now is, what's the business model for that? I think news is going through the same thing the record business went through and the music industry went through. Where people stopped buying music because they could get it for free online, right? So what's helped them, the music industry now, are these streaming services having to pay for music that people listen to. It's revived the music industry. Maybe there's a model there for news that, you talked about, consolidating and curating the news and making the organization that does that pay a fee for its production.
But also the music industry changed their business model.
Absolutely.
For a long time, records were where they made their money.
Right.
But to their credit, when downloads became free, they started realizing that, look at these classic rock bands that can charge $100 a ticket to play CMAC or the amphitheater. So it's shifted. Concerts used to be basically loss leaders to promote the record. Now they're a money center, And merchandise has become big because, okay, maybe I won't pay to download somebody's record, but I will pay $25 for their T-shirt. So that's, it can be done. That's the $1 million question is how do we all in media find a business model that works?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, print newspapers were very slow to react to the disruption that occurred with social media and with the advertising dollars shifting. People who read a print newspaper, who subscribe to print newspapers, are a much older part of the audience. In 20 years, we may not see very many actual print newspapers. What newspapers and print journalism needs to do is figure out a way to go digital, to do it effectively, and to have a different business model that allows them to make money by being a digital service rather than a print service. I don't have any students, and I ask this question in classes every year, raise your hand if you read a print newspaper. For the last 15 years, no hands go up. Absolutely none. Now that does not bode well for the newspaper business. If we have young people who haven't grown up reading a newspaper or looking at a print paper, eventually that print service is going to disappear. The question is whether or not newspaper companies can react quickly enough and find a new business model before that happens.
And that's the interesting thing, I think, for me personally, using Finger Lakes One as sort of the example I turn to, and I don't want anybody listening to think that we're being unfairly critical of just print journalism. I think journalism as a whole is sort of going through this modification of sorts, and in 10 or 15 years, every news product is probably going to look vastly different than it does right now. My guess is it's going to be less words, more video, a lot more audio, a lot more podcasts. But it makes me wonder that if in-depth journalism is going to look more like this, 4 people sitting around microphones talking, as opposed to that really sort of well-refined, month-long investigative piece that's 1,400 words long and required, 3 reporters, 4 editors, and rounds of cuts and edits and fixes and ads and follow-up investigations and conversations. Are we reaching a point where all of the product is going to have to change across the board? Because I think that's one of the things that I've seen personally is that less words, man. People want less words. They just do. It's odd, and as somebody who started in this business as just a writer, it's a little bit surprising, but at the same time, given where Facebook and Twitter, where the big written mediums are as far as social media goes, it doesn't really feel all that surprising. But at the same time, presents this giant opportunity because television still has the ability to do their product and to do a product similar to this where you're focusing on podcasts and in-depth stuff on a video and audio side. Radio has the ability to continue doing that and to expand further into the podcast game, which they basically originated. And digital organizations can just keep expanding into these new territories as their audience allows them to. Are newspapers kind of the only ones left that haven't really fully embraced the other products that are digital beyond just taking the words that they put in a newspaper and putting them on a screen?
Well, I think the newspapers are trying. I mean, if we look at this sort of, if you're hired as a young journalist now, you better be able to write, shoot pictures, and shoot video, and be able to cut together a video version of your story for the paper's website. So I think newspapers are learning that they need to be able to work in a variety of formats. I think audiences, viewers, readers want investigative pieces, want that kind of information. I look at Netflix and the explosion of documentaries that's occurred because of Netflix, right? A lot of what we see as investigative reporting now has shifted into the realm of short documentaries. And part of it's caused by the fact that Netflix has backed that and has financed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documentary productions. And it seems, and people love it. And a lot of people who are investigative journalists or want to do that kind of investigative reporting are making documentaries now. So I think there is an example of, how things are shifting. And it's not that the audience doesn't want that information. They do. Or we wouldn't see that kind of programming on streaming services. The question becomes, like you said, will the traditional print organizations be able to adapt to those kinds of models or not?
It's interesting, and Jim, as we sort of wrap this conversation up, I want to start with you, and I want to end this on a positive note. It probably feels a little daunting, a little overwhelming to some of the people who are listening, especially the people who are really passionate about, listening to the Ted Bakers and reading the Jim Meaneys and sort of seeing that product on a daily basis. What's something that makes you optimistic about what you're doing, that gives you a little bit of hope about what the news business is going to look like in 10 or 15 years?
What makes me optimistic is just the popularity of just from my own personal experience with Geneva Believer, is the popularity of Geneva Believer. I've gotten, for a city of 13,000 people, getting more than 50 to 60,000 views a year, over 20,000, 25,000 visitors a year. That's encouraging to me. That tells me that people do want more news, they want more detail, they want more deep diving into the issues. Even though on a lot of social media you see people, they see a headline and then they have a detailed opinion about what the headline says. Yeah. There are people who consume media in bits and bytes and they don't care, but there are a lot of people who crave more detailed news and it's just gonna evolve, but people still want more news than.
And Ted, you're there, you're doing it every day. You don't get a break from it unless you go on vacation, like you did last week or a couple weeks ago. What are some of the signs that are good in your mind?
Well, it's a lot of the same thing that Jim was saying. It's when you reach somebody and realize that they care about what you do and like it. It's when I do a basketball broadcast and a distant grandparent picks it up on a stream in Texas and they're glad they can hear their granddaughter play basketball. Or we go out and cover something and somebody says, "Thank you for giving our group some publicity." Or I interview nonprofits all the time and they have their event and they said, people came up to me and said, "I heard it on the radio." So we know that we're still able to reach people, and I think we'll still be able to. It's that business model, and like Steve said, I think print especially, and I'll cast the stone at our own industry. Radio has been slow in many ways to react to the new realities, but I think we'll figure it out, and we'll come up with some kind of a model that will continue to make this work for all of us.
And Steve, as you, I would think out of all of us sitting here, you have the most reason to be optimistic because you see students come every fall and they're hungry, they want to do it, they see it as a career, they see it as a life's mission. What do you see in them that really makes you feel good about the next 10 to 15 to 20 years of journalism in the news business?
Well, I'll tell you the things that make me optimistic. First of all, there are very, very bright people like you and Jim and Ted working in the business. That makes me optimistic. There are a lot of very bright and dedicated students who would like to be in the business and who are the future of the business. And I really think there's an awful lot of bright people trying to figure out what the new business model is going to be. People aren't giving up, right? I mean, Gannett didn't declare bankruptcy. GateHouse didn't declare bankruptcy. They said, let's merge and figure out a new way to do this business. Even though it might mean that the merger might mean that there may be fewer jobs in the newsroom coming, at least they're trying to figure out a new business model. Nobody's giving up on it. So those kinds of things make me very optimistic.
And as always, the way we wrap these episodes, whenever I have guests from other organizations in the area, Jim, where can folks get a hold of you and see the great news that you are actually creating every day, every week in the city of Geneva?
Just go to genevabeliever.com, also on Facebook, facebook.com/genevabeliever, and I've just recently jumped into the Twitterverse as well.
Yes, you have.
Someone already took Geneva Believer, so I'm at Believer Geneva on Twitter.
Of course. And Ted Baker?
I'm on Finger Lakes News Radio and the Finger Lakes Morning News. In Geneva, it's WGVA 95.9 FM, 1240 AM. In Auburn, it's 98.1 FM, 1590 AM, 5:30 to 9, Monday through Friday, and off Labor Day.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Ted Baker, Jim Meaney, and Steve Keeler for being here. Be sure to listen and subscribe to Inside the FLX wherever you get your podcasts. The show is available for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Anchor. We'll be back next week, and as a reminder, new episodes of Inside the FLX are available every Saturday exclusively on FingerLakes1.com.
Finger Lakes one time.